Okay, welcome everybody. Very pleased to introduce Professor Santiago Zabala today. Professor Santiago Zabala is an ICREA research professor at the philosophy of Pompeu Fabra University of Barcelona in Spain. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Al Jazeera, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among others. He's the author of several books, most recently Being at Large, Freedom in the Age of Alternative Facts, and Outspoken, a manifesto for the 21st century with Adrian Parr. His forthcoming book is Signs from the Future, A Philosophy of Warnings. In 2024, an exhibition was devoted to his book, Why Only Art Can Save Us, Aesthetics and the Absence of Emergency, at the Círculo de Belles Arts of Madrid. His talk today is entitled, Why Don't We Listen? Philosophy of Warnings. I will now hand it over to you, Santiago. Thanks.
All right. Thank you very, very much, Jamie. Thank you, Queston. Thank you for inviting me to this annual philosophy lecture. I think this is the first time I do this, so I'm very pleased. I'm honored. Thank you very much for having me. Well, I'm a big fan of your program, so it's important for me to be part of this sort of let's call them alternative programs, but they're not really alternative. I think they're more what we should all be doing, and I'm sure that we would have there would be many more schools like the one Question founded in the future. But for now, we are here together, and I am very happy to be able to talk. So, what am I going to be talking about? So, the lecture I have this 30 minutes, 35 minutes. I would be talking. It would be about this philosophy of warnings that I came up with, and which is, well, it's not a new philosophy in the sense that nothing really new happens in philosophy. Unfortunately, there are a lot of philosophers that come up with sort of new philosophies, like it's something that never happened before. But even the latest new realism philosophy, well, that I'm not so sure anything really new happens in philosophy. At least we don't really come up with totally new ideas. They all have a history, they all have a tradition, they all have philosophy behind them. And so nothing really new happens in philosophy. So this idea of philosophy of warnings, it sounds new in the sense that I don't think anyone has formulated this way. But my claim is that philosophy is a warning. So, and by saying this, I am going to try to justify not only what a philosophy of warning looks like, but also why we need a philosophy of warning. And most of all that, well, there are many philosophers that have warned us of many important issues, problems, emergency stuff. And so, and the title of the talk is Why Don't We Listen? Because listening is one of those concepts that I think that has not been developed too much in the history of philosophy, or nor at least not as much as we were supposed to. It's a little bit like the problem of aging, right? Everybody talks about death, but nobody talks about aging. And Simone de Beauvoir and very few others have actually written about aging, which is a much more complicated issue, perhaps because it touches all of us as we age, right? So warnings is instead it's a concept that I think that a lot of philosophers have been discussing, and well, at least I think that philosophy is a warning. In other words, what we do in philosophy, we are warning about things that could happen, have happened. We're supposed to talk about them, and it's related, of course, to this idea of listening. So whether we are capable of listening or not to warnings, and I think that the age, the condition, spiritual predicament, whatever you want to call it, in which we are now, it's an age that we're not really listening a lot to warnings. We don't really listen to them as we are supposed to do. I will start with a very simple example, which is probably not the best, but it works well when I talked about this. I'm sure that many of you, or at least I strongly recommend you watch it tonight. The movie Don't Look Up, a Netflix movie from a few years ago, and it's an interesting movie because it sort of points out this issue we have that we don't really listen to warnings, right? It's a story about two astronomers. One of them is Leonardo DiCaprio, that attempt to warn humanity about the approaching comet that would destroy human civilization. And well, it's a comedy, so nobody listens. But the message is there. In other words, we do not listen to warnings, even and perhaps even more if warnings come from science. Now, it is curious that we don't listen to warnings even when they come from science, because of course, if they come from philosophers, from sociologists or whoever, then we really don't listen at all. So it seems to me that why we don't listen to warnings is the fundamental question we should be asking ourselves now. And I think that it's a question that many philosophers have been asking that question, but also that even the new, so-called new, because again, I don't believe that nothing really new happens in philosophy, but even animal studies, animal philosophy, or even plant philosophy, there's a lot of that going on. There's also people studying insect philosophy. Well, all these philosophies, in a way, aren't they also a way to warn us of what will happen if we don't take care of the animals, plants, etc., etc.? In other words, we find ourselves in a situation today where, and this is something that I claim in many of my books, and that I transform into this philosophy of warning. So I always insist in this idea that, well, the greatest emergency we have today is the absence of emergency. Now, this idea that it's a sort of a transformation of the state of exception of both Agamben and many others, but it also goes against them, because I believe that this idea that this is something that you can find in Heidegger is not so explicit, but Heidegger did point out that there weren't enough emergencies going on. That we were, from a technological point of view, we were creating such an organized world that we don't really, nothing really new takes place. In other words, nothing really emerged. The emergencies we have are emergencies that, in some way, well, we prefer to let them. There's a sort of a choice there, and I think that the greatest ones, we are not the only ones, but the greatest ones we have are the ones that are absent. So climate change is an absent emergency. How is it possible that we don't treat the climate change emergency the same way, for example, we've been treating the coronavirus emergency? Now, I got vaccinated, I believe in it. That's not the issue. The point is that, well, there are emergencies that are absent, right? There are there are many of them. For example, one of the most important ones probably now is the resistance many of us have, we are starting to have with antibiotics. So that's going to be one of the greatest emergencies we have, but we don't really prepare for them, even though we know that or let's put it this way, we've been warned, right? And it's very difficult to open, if you go on The Guardian today, you would see many titles with warning on them, in particular those coming from science, but we don't listen to them. Now, it is important to remember that warnings should not be confused with prediction, right? Warnings is something different from a prediction. Warnings are not meant to convince anyone, but instead invite us to reevaluate our priorities for the future, right? It's a question of reevaluating what we want to do with the future. So a philosophy of warnings, and I think, and the subtitle of my new book coming out next year is A Philosophy of Warning, rather than Philosophy of Warning, because I think there are many philosophies of warning. For example, the ones that I just referred to, plants, animals, and so forth, insects. So this philosophy of warning is more than a philosophical elucidation of a global environmental emergency. It is actually an ontology, right? So it's actually an ontology in which these issues exist. So a philosophy of warning should be interpreted as an ontology within which there are many other regional ontologies, which are the ones that I just referred to now. So terminologically, we could say that these reacting philosophies, in other words, the plant, insects, and everything, they are regional ontologies, where ours is a fundamental philosophy that encompasses all of them. Warnings allows us to think transcendentally without losing sight of actual political, socially, and technological urgent matters, right? And there are many urgent matters that we have now that we're not taking into consideration. For example, the possibility of, we had one now recently, but it wasn't that big, but the possibility of a big blackout online. I mean, a serious blackout online could really cause serious trouble, probably much more serious trouble than the COVID pandemic. So now it is, in some way, I think the COVID pandemic in some way triggered this idea of warning, of philosophy of warning. But of course, it is not limited only to the pandemic. it is something that has to do with the idea that we are not taking them seriously into consideration. But what does this mean? Because Richard Reuter used to say that before we had prophets to tell us to be alert of the warnings of the God, but we have secularized that office into that of philosophers, who, one among equals, advise us to use our imagination, to interpret science, because those are all we can do. In other words, we can't really do more than that. So we can't really do more than warn people of what's going to happen. Now, the pandemic has shown us, if we want to take that as a sort of a paradigmatic example, has shown us how little prepared we were for a global emergency. But it wasn't a global emergency that was announced. In other words, we were warned for decades, from the World Health Organization to Mike Davis to David Quammen, and so many others have warned us that the probability of having a pandemic, a coronavirus, 11, 12, whatever it was very, very high. So warnings are announcements with a high level of probability, but they're not prediction. It's not 100% that will take place. So they actually require something from us, right? In order to trust the scientists, to trust warnings, we need to, in some way, have the ability to recognize them. And this is where one of the problems come up. So a philosophy of warning is really an ontological approach that distinguishes philosophy from other disciplines, both because it addresses its problems, in other words, the emergencies that we think that would take place, from a global point of view. But what does this mean? Because, for example, if we see, the problem we have with, I think it happens also in a lot of philosophy today, in some departments, in some schools, that there is an obsession of specialization, right? We all becoming specialists. In particular, you see this in medicine, right? But we all becoming specialists, and we sort of lose this global point of view. That doesn't mean that we have a better point of view, but we do have this global point of view that has always been in some way intrinsic of philosophy. This is why some people find it very surprising to see that Heidegger, in Introduction to Metaphysics, at a certain point, he literally writes, this word being serves as a warning to us, and a warning. So what does this mean, that the word being, in other words, our most important concept in philosophy, it's a warning, right? It is a warning that reality is not only merely made only of things. It is a warning that truth is not exclusively what can be measured or verified. But this idea is also behind the warning, or let's call them statement at this point, of very famous philosophers. For example, Michel Foucault, when he used to say that, well, our society is not one of spectacle, but one of civilians. That is a warning. Even Judith Butler, when she says gender is something performative, that is also a warning. Or even Donna Haraway, technology is not neutral. Of course not, right? But these are not statements, these are not predictions of what the future holds. These are warnings of what will happen if we do not take them into consideration. So these philosophers invite us to think beyond traditional paradigms of politics, nature, and science, but most of all warn us of what might happen if we do not or cannot listen to them. It should not come as a surprise, if we know a little history of philosophy, that warnings can be traced back to Greek mythology, Confucianism, and of course even to Plato's, even, for example, Apology. Think, for example, of Socrates when he warned Athenians after he was sentenced to death that their inequity and mendacity undermined the democracy they claimed to honor. Or even Thomas Hobbes when he warned that authority, not truth, makes the law. Or even Frantz Fanon when he warned that colonialism infects history, wounding the colonized and the colonizer as well. Also, again, Michel Foucault was once asked, and this is interesting, he was once asked whether the role of philosophy is to warn of the dangers of power. And his response was, this has always been an important function of philosophy. In its critical aspect, philosophy is that which calls into question domination at every level, in every form, and in which it exists, whether political, economical, sexual, institutional, or what have you. What else do we have? Because here there are a number of warnings we can see throughout the history of philosophy. It's quite important. And the problem we have also is but I think this is interesting and also sort of alarming, because I mentioned that we don't listen to warnings. Okay, let's say that some of you might agree that, well, it's true, we don't listen to the warnings about climate change, Trump, et cetera, et cetera. But perhaps we're not the problem, the emergency we have now, that as I like to call it, it's even greater than that, because I'm sure that many of you know Giorgio Agamben's controversial book on the COVID pandemic, which is, of course, it's a list of articles that he published in the blog entry of Quadilibet, his publisher in Italy. And he afterwards did a book which is called Where Are We Now? The Epidemic as Politics. And it is curious to find that this book, this book, first chapter, or let's call it the presentation of the book, if you open it, you will see, if you open the Italian version, okay, the original version, you will see that the first chapter is called Un'avvertenza in Italian. In other words, a warning. And of course, he was warning us. Well, he didn't get it all right. But my point is not about what Agamben was talking about. It's more about the translator, because the English translator, which I won't say who it is, you can go and look it up, or maybe the publisher, it could also be the publisher that decided to translate in a different way. But instead of translating avvertenza, which is literally a warning, they translated that for introduction. Now, actually they put forward, now that I read my notes here. So forward. Now, forward in Italian is prefazione. So we have reached a level perhaps that we are not even able to translate the word warning. We're not only listening to warning, but we're also not even translating the word anymore. So this is important because this book, this is also the problem with this, which I'm not going to only talk about this, but the problem with this is that in this book it had a second edition in a different publisher, and also the second edition had the same problem. Now, now we're talking about Giorgio Agamben, who wrote Homo Sacer, State of Exception, which both books were meant to warn us against the effects of sovereign power on life, namely that they function by integrating bare life as the focal point of the legal order and create a permanent state of exception. Warning have been a constant throughout Agamben's work, right? So Agamben is also a philosopher of warning. Now, it is important, like I mentioned before, to distinguish warning from prediction. And how can we do that? Well, one way to do that is that we have to think of that prediction call out what will take place regardless of our action. A future as the only possibility of continuation of the present. Warnings instead, and this is where things I think get interesting for anyone who is interested in making it different and trying to find out why we don't listen to warning. Warning instead point toward what is to come and are meant to involve us in the possibility of a radical break, a discontinuity with the present signalated by alarming signs that we are asked to confront. Now, predictions belong to the domain of futurology, where the future is forecast from the present trends of society. Instead, warnings are hermeneutical. That is, they strive to change the future by reinterpreting the past. This is what basically hermeneutics does. This is why in order, and I quote here Zizek, in order to change the future, we should first not understand, but change our past, reinterpret it in such a way that opens up towards a different future from the one implied by the prominent vision of the past. So warnings are sustained by signs, right? So we have a sign like the movie Don't Look Up, it sort of gives us a sign of a warning, right? They actually see it coming up. Right? They're sustained by signs that request our involvement for a different future, right? So warnings are really meant to change the future in some way, to look for a different future. A warning, as Jane, Anna Gordon, and Lewis Gordon pointed out in their books about warnings, one of the few and best books there are on the subject, a warning, they write, suggests that there is something one could do. There is always an alternative to the present. Now, this idea that there is an alternative to the present is vital today to believe in this, not necessarily from a point of view of a theological point of view as a hope, but rather that there is an alternative. So because we are so much framed within an idea that there aren't any alternatives. Instead, there are alternatives. There are always alternatives. That's why when Europe insists, the European Union insists that there is no alternative to war, as they're doing these past weeks, well, that's too much. Of course there are, right? So, but the point here is that the point for us today is not whether we accept the involvement that warning requests from us, but also, and most of all, I think, whether we're willing to confront them at all. Only our ability to accept this involvement was particularly evident in the COVID pandemic. So, like I said before, the idea that, well, our greatest emergencies are the absence of emergencies, this idea is meant to rescue us, right? Into what? Because the idea that warnings are really ways of pointing out this absence of emergency. In other words, they're meant to point out that, well, there are high probability that this will happen. But all this has to do with the idea that truth is really not enough to convince us, right? In order to listen, or let's put it this way, why don't we listen? Well, we don't listen also because truth is not enough, right? Science, they can give us all the data about climate change, but we are really not doing anything, right? However, we can have all the data, all the revelations of Edward Snowden and Julian Assange, etc., and things still don't change. And so truth is not enough in order to warn us, and we have to find different ways to get involved with warning, or even better, to listen to warning. In other words, if we don't listen to warning, it is very much related to this idea that, well, we have been, or we are also now, believing too much in transparency, right? The biggest fake news of all, as I think Stanley Fish wrote, is transparency. So the idea that we can, well, that we have the tools to inform ourselves, to understand by ourselves, for example, what the vaccine of the COVID was created with, or what were their components. So if truth is not enough to warn us, and there are numerous examples we can do, we can even make examples about our own life, right? Many people stop smoking or stop drinking when not necessarily, and most of all, they don't when their physicians tell them you have to stop smoking, you're gonna get sick. No, most of the time people stop smoking or drinking when their brother gets ill, right? When the sister gets ill or something. So this is a question of emotion, right? Warnings work better through emotion. This is why very few people know who Stanley Hansen is, right? One of the most important scientists working on the environment. But everybody knows who Greta Thunberg is, right? And why is this? Well, because it's not a question of truth. It's a question of emotion, right? Of what we are, how and what we are involved with. So the internet, and in particular social media, have intensified what? What have they intensified? Well, they have intensified a sort of realism without authority. In other words, a realism without any sort of justification. So basically any news that come up online is news, has some sort of authority. Now, this word authority is very important here, right? Because the question, and I'm sure many of you are already, I hope at least, some of you are starting to jot down a question. Well, who has the authority to warn us, right? Now, Hans-Georg Gadamer insisted, and he has included message a lot about it, that it's important. Something that very often occurs is that we often confuse authority for authoritarianism, right? Now, authority, who has the authority to warn us? Well, those that are more or less prepared to warn us. That means who? Because when the World Health Organization warned us of a pandemic that is arriving, or this issue that we will now have with antibiotics, that we are resistant to them more and more, well, this is not just someone on a blog writing, right? This is a whole structure, it's a whole institution actually that is warning us. So it does have the authority, at least as far enough authority for me not to have to inform myself, right? To trust. So my concern is that we have to begin to find ways to listen to warnings, not because they will convince us, but most of all because they will help us and invite us to reevaluate our priorities today. In other words, warnings are meant to create and to believe in alternatives, right? In those alternatives that, to make one example, Margaret Thatcher said there weren't any there anymore, right? Instead, there are alternatives, right? And who can give us this alternative, right? Who are the ones today that are not framed enough, that are not that frame at least within this condition of absence emergency that I think in which we are? Well, here is where, well, just like I just mentioned, the idea of Greta Thunberg having more effect, right? Being able to have more effects on us than maybe a scientist. Well, this also happens with art, right? So if you think about what is the difference between, I'm sure some of you have seen Bansky devoted Parliament painting where British MPs in the House of Commons are depicted as chimpanzees. I'm sure many of you have seen this great picture. Well, he's probably, that painting tells us more, right, about the latest editorial on British political deadlock, because it is not a question of truth, right? It is not a question, the difference between the two is not a question of truth, but rather of degree, of intensity and depth, right? So the same with your sister or some of our siblings getting sick from smoking. So it's not a question of knowledge, it's a question more of trust. So here art is where art becomes very important, because art is what can give us, it's what probably, or even much more than philosophy, of course, but it is one of those realms of production, let's call it that way, but we could call it in many other ways, that is able to point out those signs from the future. Now, when I mentioned before about the future, because the future of predictions, as we said, it's something that deals with futurology. In other words, something that would happen. But the future of warnings is different, right? Here we have to use the distinction between the future, 11 year, right? The future and what is coming, the coming. They translated l'avenir in several ways in English. Warnings are meant for l'avenir, for what is coming to us. But what is coming to us is something that we have to be able to listen, right? We have to be, like Heidegger used to say, andenken. We have to be also prepared to listen, right? So there's a preparation we have to create, we have to do in order to listen to those signs from l'avenir that come to us. Right? Are we able to see those signs? And this is something that is very difficult today to do, because even from a point of view of, I'm sure some of you are dating and are on Bumble or Tinder or whatever. Well, that is, for example, it's one example of a reality, a world that is made of the future of futurology. So you will find love if you open this app. Well, I'm sure many of you had some examples, have had some experience that it is not that easy, right? You don't really know when the event of love, for example, will take place. But you can be prepared for it. Right? You can prepare. You can also become an interpreter, right? You can also be able to distinguish the signs from the future that come. And so the question is not so much whether the great love will appear, but rather whether if I am prepared for it. But being prepared for it requires also listening, right? Requires also trust, right? Requires also opening up in some way. So a philosophy of warning is meant to do what? Well, it's meant to create this alternative, remind us of this alternative. It's also meant to tell us that we have to get involved. In other words, to believe, to trust, we have to get involved. So when, for those of us who practice hermeneutic philosophy or have studied within the hermeneutical tradition like I have, this is where interpretation becomes vital, right? It is really something that concerns your being, your existence. In order to believe, you really have to get involved in interpretation, right? That's why they're all different, right? And you will and the way you respond will be different every time. So now coming back and trying to finish, because I don't really have that much time. I have a lot more to say, but you can find that in the book when it comes out next year, which I hope it won't be too expensive. But anyway, and it's curious. There are three examples I want to make here before I finish, because one is Bruno Latour, the other one is Jonathan Glaser, and the third one is John Pilger. Now, Bruno Latour, in an article that came out in The Guardian at the beginning of the pandemic, he said that, and I quote, "It would be a mistake to believe that the pandemic is a crisis that will end. Instead, it is a perfect warning of what is coming." Right? What I call the new climate regime. It appears that all the resources of science, humanities, the arts will have to be mobilized once again to shift our attention to shared terrestrial conditions. In other words, he interpreted the pandemic as a warning. And that, in a way, it was actually a pretty good warning, because we could have had, we might have a much worse pandemic than the one we had. Also, a philosophy of warning that searches, like I mentioned before, and strives for alternatives, well, it is also a philosophy that found completely wrong and completely insane this idea that was running around during the pandemic, that let's get back to normality as soon as possible. Well, getting back to normality only implied getting back to the situation in which we were, that actually created the pandemic, right? Second example I want to make, Jonathan Glaser, who described his 2023 movie, The Zone of Interest, that I highly recommend. He said, "The zone of interest is not a document. It is not a history lesson. It is a warning." Again, he's using here what the movie talks about, I'm sure some of you have seen, as a warning. That's something that can happen again. In other words, and that is actually happening now, not too far from here, actually. So it is also the idea that we have to reinterpret history as a warning could actually come quite handy if we think about it, right? And then, of course, there's John Pilger, who wrote in 2019 that the shocking arrest of Julian Assange carries a warning for all who, as Oscar Wilde wrote, hope to advance towards civilization. Now, the most interesting feature of Latour, Glaser, and Pilger's warning is the projection towards the future they want to convey and the political pressure they're trying to exercise through science. It is this pressure that can envision the seeds of a politics of warnings. Now, what would a politics of warning look like? And I'm not going to go into this, but a politics of warning is interesting. In other words, is it even possible to practice a politics of warning that, for example, might require preparing for warnings that we are not preparing for? This politics is not primarily meant to outline the steps we must take to prevent another pandemic, Holocaust, or injustice, but also to resist the global return to order through realism, which is also at the origins of this event. In other words, what I mentioned before, that we live now in a condition where the greatest emergency is the absence of emergency. In other words, that the global world order is also a call to order. In other words, a call to follow specifically what the NATO tells us, etc., etc., etc. It's based on this idea of realism. In other words, this idea that we can have a direct vision, we don't even need interpretation anymore, right? That we can actually find out things on our own. Now, of course, the politicians that follow most of all, that are mostly against warnings, most of the time they are right-wing populists, like Trump, like Bolsonaro, right? Or even Milei now, I hear. So the question is it possible to build a politics around the notion of warning? Is it possible to start to listen to warnings? Now, if we agree with Zizek that what is important here are not so much answers philosophers give or try to convey, but rather the question, this is the question we should be answering now. Why are we not listening to warnings? And how come? And maybe those philosophies of insects, of animals, of plants are also a way of discussing this warning, right? There are indirectly also philosophies of warning. And I think that if we don't listen, well, the future is going to be bleak because the future will be of warning or there won't be any future at all. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you so much, Santiago. That was brilliant. We've got a few questions, but I just wanted to say before I really liked the distinction you draw there between the kind of discontinuous time of the warning and the very linear time of the prediction. Made me think of the way that Heidegger talks about the work of art and the possibility of a different relation, I suppose, to temporality and to the world that the art object can kind of lead us towards. Yeah, so I thought that was really, really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So first question comes from Paula in Argentina. Professor Zabala states philosophy is a warning, but how does this make sense from within a typical philosophy department in the United States and now nearly everywhere else? Because philosophy has become a handmaiden for science profit university industry. So where can philosophy be a warning today if it can't be so in the traditional university? Thank you.
Okay, wow. My unlucky day. This is a difficult question. Well, in the United States, for example, and unfortunately also in Europe now, there's this called thing, well, I think it's been a while now, trigger warning, right? We're supposed to tell the students or our audience, even before we actually begin, that they might make an example that might bother them. Well, philosophy should do precisely that, right? So the idea is to rescue us not from warning, but to rescue us into warning. Philosophy is supposed to make sure that we are involved in the emergency that we have in front of us, rather than we're supposed to let's put it this way: sciences are the ones that rescue us from warning. We are supposed to be rescuing ourselves into warning. Now, the problem with departments in so many places, and also in Europe, many of them not being able to be, let's say, critical enough in order to. That's also part of what this department have become, and also part of there are many social political reasons for this. But the idea is that, well, it doesn't necessarily mean that whether most of these departments are practicing a very conservative, a very most of them are analytic department, and most of them are not. They don't consider philosophy to have anything to do with society, religion, and art. In other words, that it's basically a specialized discipline. What can we do against them? We can continue to practice how philosophy has always been practiced. And we have to be very careful where we go and where we study. And that's basically all we can do. Now, we need to, if I'm saying, my idea that philosophy is a warning does not imply that, all departments are thinking about warning. No, on the contrary. They don't know. Many of them don't even know. I mean, most of these philosophies of plants or animals, I doubt they see their practice as being warning us of the consequences of not taking care of animal, plants, or not necessarily. But it would be very difficult for them. And I spoke to some of them. They were concerned because, in a way, what philosophy really does and I think philosophy has always done that, at least for us Heideggerian, is we go back. In other words, phenomenologically, we have to go further back to the origin. That might imply pointing out that, we have that our ideas are actually. That's why I insist so much on this idea. Nothing really new happens in philosophy, because, of course, it doesn't. If the idea is to always go phenomenologically back and find a different foundation, or perhaps many different foundations, or even worse, just a few traces of foundations, whatever it is. Well, that's the idea. The idea is that we have to be cautious enough and believe more in warnings rather than in. Now, unfortunately, the planet in which we live, the condition in which we live, is one in which warnings are not listened to, and where departments are playing around with semantic games. So yeah, that's the situation. But the fact that we're not listening to warnings, that's part of the emergency. The fact that philosophy departments in many places are not teaching history of philosophy, that's part of the emergency. So it's a fair question, but that does not mean that it unjustifies what I am trying to explain, right? I'm actually trying to explain precisely that problem, right?
Great, thank you very much. Question 2 comes from Francisca in Rome. Your work draws on art. Is art also a warning too? Where does art exist today, on your view, Professor Zabala?
Okay, so art is not aesthetics, right? So art has nothing to do with aesthetics, and art, the more it has to do with aesthetics, the less it's art. Art, from my perspective, but my perspective is basically Heidegger, Gadamer. Art is just an excuse. Art is just one other realm where being can emerge. Religion is also another realm where being can emerge. Science is also another realm where being can emerge. It can take place in many different places. One reason why I think it's easier to look at art for being's emergence, it's because the art world in general, and let's be more specific, artists in general, they're not that framed within an institution that has to follow certain rules, like there are certain rules I have to follow in the university too. So the reason for looking at art, and by art I don't mean whatever happens in every big biennale or art fair. It's a question of looking at specific artists that they allow this being to emerge. In other words, that alternative that warnings, for example, point out. If you look at the British duo artist Kenneth Phillips, they have this very famous Photoshop of Tony Blair taking a picture where there's this big explosion behind him, and he's taking a selfie and he's smiling. Well, I think that's another example where that warning comes up, because that same selfie that Blair that they mounted that Photoshop, today many could take that, right? Today you could have that same work of art would work very well with from Putin to Netanyahu. Okay, so warnings are a place where this alternative can take place, and art is one of the realms where that can take place. But this has nothing to do with aesthetics. It has more to do with thinking, where does being emerge? And it is our obligation as philosophers to think, and most of all, to rescue us into those places where being can emerge. And of course, warnings is one of them, right? Because it is not founded on truth, it is only founded on announcement, it requires our involvement, etc., etc.
Great, thank you. You mentioned Banksy as well at one point, I think, and it's interesting, living in Bristol where Banksy is, you can walk around and there's Banksys everywhere, and it's I guess an interesting example of that being whether one is prepared to listen, or whether it becomes part of the backdrop of one's everyday reality. Okay, question 3 from Adam in the USA. Isn't your talk designed to scare people off or to put fear in them? Why do philosophers feel like it's their job to strike fear in people?
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know whether there is something that philosophers should do in general, and I don't think I I am surprised someone might read as the thing is, can you really be that shocked when I discuss or I point out absent emergencies, in other words, great emergencies, which are those that we actually already know them? I mean, the emergencies I mentioned before, I don't think we really supposed to be. The thing is, philosophers are not supposed to solve any problems. We're supposed to find the right questions. We're supposed to disclose the ways we can find those questions, and whether I literally said we have to be rescued into greatest emergency. Yes, I do think that's there, but that has also to do with salvation. In other words, when I said before that, well, the future will be of warnings or it won't be at all, and you think about all the people warning us about the possibilities of nuclear war now. Well, yeah, I think that's part of trying to save ourselves from not listening to this warning. So I don't think it's I don't really want to scare away actually nobody. Otherwise, nobody will read me or even have the courtesy to listen to me today. But on the contrary, I want to make sure that if we're going to listen to each other, let's put it this way, let's make sure that we discuss our greatest emergencies. And those greatest emergencies are the ones we are not really taking into consideration. Okay, just one example: 7 million people, more or less, die per year of lung cancer, more or less, due to the quality of the air, even here in Barcelona. Shouldn't we be treating that emergency like we treated the coronavirus? I think we should.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Question 4. Where do you side with the hermeneutical tradition or the ontological tradition, and why?
Where do I?
Yeah, where do you side with the hermeneutical tradition or the ontological tradition?
Okay. Well, hermeneutics is an ontology. Hermeneutics is an ontology as Heidegger sort of set it up. And then Gadamer also proceeded to point that out. So I'm not sure whether I side with one or the other. Interpretation is a way of reminding us that all relation with the world we have is an ontological one. So it's a relationship that transcends in some way objects, truths, science also, right? That's why Heidegger insisted that science doesn't really think, it calculates. We think. So I don't think it's a question of, perhaps the question we could twist a little bit the question and say, well, whether do I side with hermeneutic ontology or do I side with the history, with the metaphysical tradition? Well, at that point, probably I would side more with the hermeneutical tradition, which is a tradition that tries to deconstruct, interpret, etc., all those frames that have been constructed throughout our philosophical tradition, which, if we look at it carefully, we would see it particularly logocentric, etc., right? So I side with the hermeneutic. I even side with the hermeneutic communist, which is an interesting concept. But anyway.
Thank you. Okay, so that's it for the questions, but I had one just before we close, if that's all right. I'm not sure if you're familiar with I don't know who the book is by, but I think it's called Signs of Danger, and it's about that problem of like a nuclear waste site that won't decay for millions of years, and how do we establish a warning sign that any future civilization might be able to interpret? And I guess the question is, are warnings always embedded in like the specific moment that they're warning about, or is it possible to create a warning that could last or far outlast the problem in its immediacy?
Right. Okay. So this is difficult. So the thing is that the warnings we have, they are quite solid. I mean, they have scientific data, they have documents, Edward Snowden showed us all the documents. He's in Russia living today. So imagine the effect that objectivity had. That's the point. The point is not so much whether the warning can be as the best artist can give us the best warning. That's not the issue. The warnings are there. The question is that we are today in a condition where we are also incapable even of translating the word warning, okay? Like they haven't been able to do in Agamben's book. I mean, there's no doubt that Agamben, if you look at other books of Agamben in Italian, many of them have prefazione, introduzione. They don't all have advertenza. So my concern is more about how us interpreters, because that's what we are going to be able to listen to warnings. And also one, considering all the questions, which I really appreciate them, all the questions that emerged, it's important to point out, well, I suggested that philosophy is a warning. By that, I'm not literally saying that, oh, you guys have all been pointing out warnings, just don't know that. You're stupid, you don't know that. I'm not saying that. But I am proposing a different interpretation of the history of philosophy and of what philosophy is, pointing out that it is not something that has anything to do with what most of philosophy has become, like one of the questions referred to in some departments. Philosophy is not about being specialist in something, except maybe if you're a specialist in one particular philosophy from history of philosophy, like those Heideggerians that know everything about Heidegger. Philosophy is about moving forward, in other words, from, I think, a good Heideggerian or a good some Derridean or whatever you want to call him, Derrida or Heidegger should be a starting point to philosophize. It shouldn't be an end point. We're not philologists, right? So the point of proposing that philosophy is a warning, and there are many warnings that we don't really consider them. We don't even see that philosophy is actually all we can do is warn you. In other words, we cannot convince you. Nobody ever convinced anyone. Like my supervisor used to say, Vattimo, you don't convince anyone. So don't even waste too much time trying to convince them. People would be convinced on their own. How? Well, conversations, dialogues. This is why, if you look, the example here, I think that we should make, and with this I stop, and I want to take everybody Sunday time, afternoon or lunchtime away. But so what is a classic, right? What is a great classic? Gadamer, Shakespeare, whatever you want to call them, Breaking Bad, whatever you consider a great classic. Well, a great classic, like Gadamer used to say, has nothing to do with the origin. It has to do with the effects it continues to have. In other words, the consequences it continues to have, independently of where it was done, who did it, or whatever. That's why, for example, the Bible has such a big effect, right? Whether you like it or not, it still has effect today. So warnings are a little bit the same way. Those warnings that last are probably the ones that have the greater effects. The problem is not them. The problem is that we're not listening. And one way to listen might be perhaps trying to reinterpret philosophy as a warning, perhaps trying also to interpret movies as a warning. Perhaps those are the ones that speak to us. And by us, I mean our condition as interpreters. The more we are autonomous interpreters, or even original interpreters, you want to use some more lame term, well, the more we will believe in warnings.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you so much. We will end the live stream there. Again, thank you so much, Professor Zabala. That was a fascinating talk. Thank you, everyone who asked questions. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Okay, that's it.